Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
What do near-death experiences and past lives have to do with the evolution of consciousness? While they may seem unrelated, do they ever cross paths? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, www.vocbn.ca. Joining us now to explore near-death experiences and past lives as they relate to evolution of consciousness is Andy Tomlinson, a known expert in past lives and the soul experiences between lives. He began his career originally as a psychologist and a psychotherapist, and then moved into therapy with past lives. He was the founder of the Past Life Regression Academy, which trained over 500 therapists worldwide. And he is also known for his books, Healing the Eternal Soul, Exploring the Eternal Soul, and Transforming the Eternal Soul. He's also the co-author of a new book, Between Lives Past-Life Regression, Near-Death Experiences, and Evolution of Consciousness. His website, pioneeringnewconsciousness.com. Andy, thank you so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. So you're over across the pond there, aren't you?
Yeah, that's it. We're in the UK, but with internet, a lot of my work is international, so it doesn't really matter too much where you reside. But it's a fascinating part of the world where I live. It's quite close to Stonehenge and Glastonbury, which is an amazing energetic spot in the planet. Glastonbury is referred to as the heart chakra, so it's a place that we frequent very often.
I can see why. So you began your career as a psychologist and a psychotherapist. How did you become involved in past lives?
Well, I did 4 years of training as a psychotherapist. And I remember at one stage I said, what happens if someone has a past life? And remember, we're going back 25 years where past life was still very much in its infancy, certainly in the Western world. And the trainer said, just treat it as a metaphor. So that was the level of training that I had. And shortly after, a lady came to me and said, I keep having these visions of Venice. I kind of, maybe I've had a past life connected with Venice. Could you help? So I hadn't had any training, so I used my hypnosis skills to take her to a very deep levels of trance. And then she connected with a past life. And it turned out that she was the keeper of prostitutes that looked after the interests of the sailors. And in those days, they were considered the lowest of the low in society. And then when I brought her out of the session, she hadn't remembered anything because of the depth of hypnosis she'd been to, but I'd recorded everything. And I said, well, take away the recording, listen to it. And if you've got any questions, let me know. And I bumped into her a couple of weeks later and I said, oh, how did you get on with the recording? I said, I don't know if I want to talk to you. I thought, oh my goodness, what have I done wrong? This was the very first past life regression and I hadn't had any training. She said, well, I gathered all my friends round to listen to my past life, and it turned out I was a keeper of prostitutes. She said, I'm disgusted. And of course, this does illustrate a rather interesting point about past lives, is that people don't control them. They come spontaneously. And certainly in this case, it was the very last thing she would have expected to have as a past life.
That's kind of reassuring, or what do I want to say, validating, isn't it, when it's the last thing you'd expect? Yeah.
And a lot of people think that in past lives they may go back by being famous people or nobility or things like that. And quite often they go back as just common people, living often in a form of subsistence, because times were very hard as you go in the past. But there'd be some sort of emotional issue or some sort of lesson that they were working through. But before I really, after that particular encounter, I thought, well, I have to really be trained in working with past lives, because I had a real interest in it. And I came across a real big pioneer in past lives called Roger Wilga. He was very active, particularly in America. He wrote 1 or 2 books. And he'd actually pioneered the use of body therapy. In other words, that he discovered that in past lives, not only do emotions come to the surface from the past life, but sometimes body sensations. And if you work with the body sensations and clear it with body movement, you get the most amazing results. So I went on Roger's 2 years training and was really fascinated how, when these stories spontaneously came through, how the emotions are. I mean, I'll give you an example to illustrate it. I had a client who had a problem with her hands and couldn't pick anything up. She had an incredible pain in her hands and going down her arms. She'd been for numerous medical tests and no one could really explain what it was. And I took her into a past life, and she'd been a young girl looking after an orphanage, and there'd been a fire, and she tried to rescue 2 of the orphans and had failed, and in the process burnt her hands before she died. And she carried away this wound of the pain in her hands, the emotions associated with desperation of not being able to rescue the children. And it turned out that, because quite often when souls haven't completed something in one life, they'll have another life where they can work through and resolve the issues. And in her current life, she had 2 children, and her partner was abusing her, and they'd separated, and he was trying to take the children away. And of course, the process of trying to rescue the children had triggered this wound and this pain in her arm. And the way of working with that as a therapist is to help people complete what they couldn't in the past life. In this case, it was grabbing hold of the children, which was represented by a couple of pillows. But for the person, it felt like they were really bringing those children to them. And it resolved, and it went away. And it's almost like miracle work when really intense emotions and physical sensations can be resolved just in one session.
Amazing. So, what are soul experiences between lives?
Yeah, well, I spent 5 years learning about hypnosis. And then when I worked with Roger Wolgar and his training, he used to use something called bridges, which was that people could spontaneously go into the past lives just by getting into the posture or tuning into the emotions, and the past life would emerge. And I thought, why have I spent 5 years of my life learning about hypnosis when I don't need to use it? And then I came across this wonderful person called Michael Newton, who'd really pioneered the process of using deep hypnosis to take people into what appeared to be the soul memories between lives. And he'd worked with thousands of cases and published his findings. And I suddenly discovered he was doing his very last training event in Los Angeles in a week's time. And there was one place left. So I thought, oh, I think that's for me. So I had to explain to my partner at the time why all of a sudden I was traveling halfway around the world to do a workshop that I'd never talked about before. So I had to promise a little bit of a holiday afterwards for her to join me and to be very receptive to the idea. And I went through his training and worked very closely with Michael for a number of years. And one of the wonderful things with this sort of work is that people discover a lot more about who they really are. I mean, for example, I had a lady from Canada who contacted me and said, could I have a Between Life Regression? So I thought it was rather unusual, the fact that she wanted to fly all the way over from Canada to see me. But I was very delighted, and she said she was doing some other things. So I arranged a session. And it turned out that her husband had died 6 months earlier. And she was having a lot of trouble getting over the loss of her husband. So anyway, we went through a past life death, and the past life death had been one where her husband had gone to war and had got killed, and then she was left by herself and had a lot of trouble coping and had given up on life, which is a bit like a form of suicide. And when she passed over, she was met by a spirit guide, and this is about the most severe, because a suicide is a big thing in the spirit realms, because a life opportunity is considered very precious because it is an opportunity to have lots of learning. So the spirit guide was there with the arms crossed and said, this is the third one now, isn't it? And she'd had 2 other lives where a loved one had got lost and she was unable to cope with it. So she was reunited with the spiritual essence of her husband from that past life. And they have something called soul groups, which are groups of souls that often plan different roles in different lives. So a husband and wife may change roles, or a daughter or a husband may change roles. Then it makes planning for lives a lot easier because it's kept within a small group. And often in soul groups, there tends to be a theme that they're all working to. So she got together with her husband and started to plan the next life, which is her current life. And they came up with the idea that she would be a woman again, her husband would die a bit earlier, but they would be quite independent. They would have their own businesses, so it was a lot easier to cope. And he was going to learn patience. So her role was to...
Well, Andy, I hate to interrupt, but we're going to have to leave this as a cliffhanger because it's time for a station break. Andy and I will return very shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. So, if we reincarnate, what happens to us between one life and another? With us this hour discussing the possibility of past lives is Andy Tomlinson, the author of Between Lives Past-Life Regression, Near-Death Experiences, and the Evolution of Consciousness. Andy, we were talking about a case study where a woman had suicided several times in past lives because she couldn't cope being without a partner that she'd lost. And you said that they got together between lives, apparently, and made a plan for the next life. Is that very common? Is that what happens between lives? Is we get together with our soul group and make a plan for the next one? And if so, I want to read the small print.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be 2 major stages. The first stage, having shared a lot of the dense energies of the emotions and the leaving the physical body behind and starting to vibrate at the soul vibration, is to do some sort of review of the past life. And the review of the past life is often done by the soul itself, maybe going over, reviewing aspects of the experience with perhaps a spirit guide, which is a hopeful being of light that acts as a guide and a mentor to the soul in question. And then the other part is the planning part.
Let me interrupt you for just a minute. So you're talking about a life review. Is that the same as what people report during a near-death experience? They kind of start to go into that sometimes,
Yeah.
but there isn't always a helping spirit there when that goes on. They just start having memories. When does the helping spirit show up?
Well, it really varies. Some souls, when they're doing the life review, can do it all by themselves. That tends to be the more evolved souls. Younger souls probably need the experience of other souls to help them see it in a different perspective. I mean, for example, there was a case of a soul called Wiyaka who was doing the past life review, and he'd been a bully. And when he was doing the review, he said, oh, well, it was that other little person's fault. He deserved to all the things he got. So his spirit guide said, I want you to swap places, go into the body of the person you bullied and just see what it feels like. And he did that, and he came back and full of remorse and said, I'm never, ever going to do that again. And it's almost like sometimes the review needs to involve some sort of depth. With near-death experiences, there can be reviews with evolved spirits of light, just as in the case of Between Lives. Or sometimes it's solitary. It may not necessarily be quite as complete because obviously the life is only partway through, whereas with a past life, they've completed the whole of the past life.
Past life. So when you're going through the past life review, I mean the life review, is part of the purpose there, obviously, from what you're saying, to learn your lessons, if you will. But is it also an issue with frequency that as we learn our lessons, as we make corrections, we rise in frequency, we become more spiritual beings? Is that part of the purpose, do you suppose?
Well, it's to continue to evolve, and as souls evolve, they change the vibration. And certainly the beings of light that don't need to incarnate in physical form anymore tend to generally have a lot higher vibrational frequency. But it's up to souls that they can choose to stay at the vibration that they want or continue to grow. It's a little bit like being at school. You know, you can go through your lessons and then go to the next grade and continue to move up. Or if you don't, you have to just redo the class again. You know, and it's not, I mean, at school, probably there would be a judgment, but in the spirit realms, there's no judgment. You know, there's no time constraint to say things have got to be done by a particular date because the soul is eternal. There's the only physical time is being in a physical body, and it's all associated with the birth and the death. And then everything in between is just the experience. But just coming back,
You mentioned BLSR. What is that?
Between Lives Spiritual Regression.
Okay.
Yeah. It's called quite a number of things. Some people call it LBL, Lives Between Lives. There's a few terminology, but it's the experience that souls experience between lives. So perhaps I'll just use the word between lives so that it's a common term people can understand. But just going back to the case study that I talked about before, about the lady who'd been committing suicide, she'd planned that she would be independent, and then they would plan a life where the husband would die, He'd be learning about patience, so she would stop him from going into businesses too quickly, and he would die early, and then she, being relatively independent, would be able to continue her life. And one of the things that happens between lives is there tends to be a final review in order to try to make sure that there's every likelihood of the plan being successful. And this is normally done by very evolved spirits of light that are called things like elders or wise ones. And in this case, they said that she needed to have, or they recommended that she has a spiritual experience in order just to help us see a spiritual perspective. And they were referring to the Between Life Regression that she'd come to see me about. So she had the session, understood it all, and was able to go back, and she could see the spiritual perspective, and that enabled her to get through the loss, get on with her life, and she'd work through a life lesson that she'd had a number of previous lifetimes difficulty getting through.
So tell us about your research between near-death experience and between life experience.
Yeah, well, I've been both a therapist and a trainer with both past lives and between lives for around about 20 years now, over 20 years. And 2 or 3 years ago, my wife, who does exactly the same things that I do, she's a therapist and a trainer in the same area, had a near-death experience during COVID. And in her experience, she noticed a similarity between that experience and the between life sessions that she'd had before. And that set us on a trail of saying, well, wonder how many other people have had a similar sort of experience. And it was quite fortunate because with all of the graduates that I've been training with Between Lives, I had about 530 case studies with separate subjects, where in order to get the qualification, the students had to write it up. There was a questionnaire and they had to fill in information about each of the stages or what happened. So we had a very comprehensive questionnaire for Between Lives on quite a large number of people. And we did some work with the pioneers of near-death experience, people like Pin Van Lommel and Grayson and Peter Fenwick, all really amazing medical people who'd written peer review near-death experience accounts, and all of them had had questionnaires that they asked the people to fill it in. So they were able to pull information about their experience, because all of them were varied to some degree or other. So we were able to match together around about 400 near-death experience with over 500 between life experiences to look for the similarities. And we found an amazing similarity. Now, obviously, we couldn't go through the whole of the between life experience because that goes all the way through to reincarnation. And of course, with a near-death experience, it only goes to a certain point, and then the person comes back again. But we were able to compare the early stages of the between life regression and got the most amazing results. But it wasn't just the comparison. You know, I mean, things like past life reviews or life reviews wherein seeing spirits of light, feeling of peace, and audio experiences and a whole host of other experiences. But it wasn't just the similarity of those experiences, it was the impact of them that we found particularly interesting. Now, for example, with the near-death experience, Rena, the co-author of the book that you mentioned earlier with me, she found that after her near-death experience, she became much more intuitive. She was able to be much more focused on what she wanted to do from a soul perspective without being sidetracked by trying to please people. She was able to bring a joy into life. I mean, she didn't have a fear of death.
It's kind of like a reset, isn't it? It's like
It's like a
what's
reset.
really important here. Let's get
And then
straight.
we said, okay, well, let's compare that with Between Life Regression. We didn't have quite as many people to compare it with, but we had 15, and we were able to compare that. And we found quite a lot of similarity. I mean, there were some differences. One of the major differences is that with a near-death experience, and it's not planned, and it's real time, and people don't know quite what's going to happen. You know, am I going to come back? Is this the end? Whereas a Between Life Regression is planned, and it's like going through a memory of something that happened in the past rather than real time. You know, a little bit like the difference between having a date and having a romantic encounter, as opposed to watching a video or a film of a romantic encounter. Both of them can be really intense, but one of them, when you're actually in it and you're associated in it, is much more profound. But we're able to find, and obviously one of the other differences is that most people who come for a Between Life experience are pretty much aware that about past lives, and the fear of death wasn't particularly high. Whereas a lot of people who have near-death experience, maybe atheists, didn't have any particular spiritual experience. So for them, not being afraid of death was a real big shift, great big change. So there were some interesting similarities and differences. But the thing that we found most amazing is what we call expanded consciousness. In other words, when people are in the Between Life experience, or when they're in a near-death experience where it's very, very similar, they're in a
And
completely different
Andy,
place
and
consciously.
Andy, we're going to have to pick up on expanded consciousness on the other side of a station break. Andy and I will be right back to continue our discussion. You stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Is consciousness in the brain? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing consciousness is Andy Tomlinson. His website, pioneeringnewconsciousness.com. Andy, we had followed from past life and between life experiences into the point that we're discussing consciousness. And one of the things that stands out between past life, near-death experiences, between lives is there's no body involved, okay? So people historically have thought of consciousness being a function of the brain. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think an analogy could be a TV set. So that, for example, we watch the TV set and we see images and sounds, but it can't be said that the information is in the TV. It comes on waves and it's all around us. You know, we could get another TV and get the same information. So the TV acts almost as a receiver of the information. And it's almost like our physical body acts as a receiver for consciousness. I mean, some aspects of consciousness obviously are created in the brain, such as the things we taste and smell and our immediate thoughts. But a lot of our consciousness is outside the brain. And obviously at the point of death or near-death experience, it's that consciousness that leaves the physical body and continues its journey.
Does the consciousness kind of hang out close to the body, but also in contact with other things?
Well, with near-death experiences, it's almost like the experience isn't under the control of the person. There's almost like a rush, and then people suddenly find themselves wherever they are, and then they're getting enormous information, and then at some point a decision has to be made. Either they're told it's not their time, or they're given a choice: do you want to go back and continue? And for those that are given a choice, it's very, very difficult to go back, because they are in this amazing expanded consciousness state, and to suddenly go back into a human body with all of the events that are happening in the world around us at the moment is quite a brave thing to do.
What is it about the human body that limits the experience of consciousness?
Well, the thing that limits it is that for a lot of people, consciousness is very much a 3-day experience, or possibly 4D if you include time. So in other words, they got a very materialistic view of life, and their consciousness exists in that dimension. And that's okay, because they'll be down here for some reason to have some sort of emotional lesson that they may be working through. And then when that lesson is finished, they can leave the body. Whether they believe in reincarnation doesn't really matter. Just in the same way with people who have a near-death experience, it doesn't matter whether they believe in it or not. Their consciousness just leaves the body and continues.
So do we necessarily evolve in consciousness from lifetime to the next, one lifetime to the next, or can we backslide sometimes too?
Yeah, well, that's certainly the case. Yeah, it's a bit like that snakes and ladders game where you kind of go around, and then you get on the snake, you go up, or is it ladders and you go up, but if you hit a snake, you come down. There can be a little bit like that. But it depends on how difficult the plan is. I mean, some people, when they're planning, maybe, to use an analogy, may plan to have climb Mount Everest, as opposed to climbing a little hill. And it may sound ever so easily in the spirit realms to do that. And then, of course, they're halfway up Mount Everest thinking, why on earth have I chosen this sort of life? And of course, it's their choice. And quite often, the evolved spirits of light are saying, well, we really think you should be taking these smaller hills first before you take Mount Everest. And some souls are in a rush to grow and develop. And if they rush too much, then they don't get up Mount Everest, and they have to come back and work at it slightly differently.
So do lives, this is a good one. Do lives occur in order, or are we always reborn into the future, or can we be reborn into a past time?
Okay, this is the nature of time. Do you know, the reality that we experience on Earth is just a little tiny part of the spiritual reality that exists out there. And I think no matter how evolved we are as souls, we still only see a tiny glimpse of the reality out there. On the Earth plane, it's just too hard for people to think of anything other than the past is something that happened before, the present is the here and now, and the future is something we can make it into. And if you start thinking about the past and the present and the future all being the same moment of time, people's brains fry, and it's not helpful. And the whole point about being on Earth is to learn and move forward. So I've always taken the point of keeping things at a level where people can understand and make sense of it.
So do we have any say about when and where we incarnate?
Yeah, there's quite often, I think a lot depends on the souls. Some souls, if they've had one or two lives where it hasn't quite worked out right, maybe given something called a package. So in other words, they've worked out the type of body, the type of life. The soul has a choice to either take this or not. Nothing is ever forced on the soul. Most souls, as they start to evolve and have a little bit more wisdom of not necessarily wanting to jump into the Mount Everest, the first life that they have, could be given a choice of 2 or 3 lives, perhaps an easy life, a hard life, or something in between, but it'd be on the theme of whatever they want to learn about. It could be learning about some aspect of love or working through some aspect of emotion. I had one person who'd been a slave in one life, and the next life they were coming back as a perpetrator, just so they can experience things from different perspectives. And then when a lesson has been mastered, they can let go of that and move on.
So do we choose what lessons we want to approach? You said that we have, say 3 lives to choose from where we work with that issue, but do we
Yeah.
get to choose, well, I don't want to work on that this time. I'd like to work on something else.
Sometimes that's possible. I mean, sometimes generally most souls are eager to get back. It's like exciting. It's like children having toys. Where you say to children, oh, hang on a minute, you better not play with that. You've got too many toys here. Oh, no, I want all my toys. So souls tend to be normally overeager in what they want to do. And it tends to be the evolved spirits of light that are evolving the plan. They may say something like, you had a really difficult life last time. Why not have a very simple life? Be in a happy family situation, just discover the strengths that you have. Maybe some of those strengths you can bring back when you start to have your Everest type life. So they get some guidance, but at the end of the day, it's a soul's choice, and there's no right or wrong. There's just a different type of experience that they have.
Well, it sounds like when we're not in the physical body, we get a distorted perspective as to how difficult something is going to be. Like,
Yeah.
we're all about it. Like I said, where was the small print and why didn't I get to read it, right?
Well, yeah, everything, there's like the human perspective and the spiritual perspective. I mean, for example, a death, from a human perspective, that's an unpleasant thing. From a spiritual perspective, that's the end of a very difficult life, and the soul's going to go through, shed off all of the dense energy, rejoin the soul group, perhaps have some sort of celebration party. So they see that as a wonderful start. Whereas a birth, the human perspective is, oh, isn't it wonderful? We've got a new baby. Where the spiritual perspective is the soul group members may be saying, that's a really difficult life. We wish you well. Oh my goodness.
Now you've got to cram all that you are into this little tiny form and it won't fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem with a lot of people is we're always looking at it from a human perspective. One of the advantages of having past life experiences or between life experiences is people start to get a spiritual perspective, start to look at life in a different way. And certainly the experiences of near-death experience and between life experiences have a profound effect on people. And as I mentioned before, they quite often start to expand consciousness. There is something called moving to the fifth dimension that a number of people talk about. I really refer to this as a new consciousness. And what that means is the fifth dimension is the dimension of expanded consciousness and being aware of the spirit realms and working cooperatively with guides and other evolved spirits of light, just as souls do between lives. And
Well,
that's
a lot a
possible.
lot of a lot of religions have uh, reference to a soul getting stuck. So, like the Catholics talk about purgatory, the Buddhists talk about the Bardo. Is there a possibility of not making the transition completely? And what does that look like?
I think the one thing that is probably worth just explaining, there's a difference between religious beliefs and the near-death experiences and the between-life experiences, is that a lot of religions are based on information that they're given. Whereas near-death experiences are people's actual experiences. This is what I saw, this is what I did. And not just one person, but hundreds and thousands. And in fact, near-death experiences, there have been millions of people that have had it. And between life experiences, again, it's people's experiences. So obviously, having a religion and if it's helpful for people to live their lives through having it, then that's wonderful. But it is worth just remembering that this isn't just my view that I'm expressing. All I'm doing is expressing the experiences people have and how that is different than a religion.
I was coming at it from a comparative mythology point of view, in that
Okay.
when you see the same concept in various locations, there might be something that they're describing.
Yeah. Well, purgatory or hell is the state where after physical death, instead of moving on to the light, the soul stays earthbound. They keep all their emotions intact, and because they don't have a physical body, then time doesn't decay, and they're staying with these last thoughts, these last unhelpful emotions, and that is the state until they're ready to let go of it, and then at some point they will move on.
And thus we have the ghost. Well, it's time for another station break. So please stay with us as Andy and I continue to explore NEDs, past lives, and soul experiences between lives. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. Can past lives help us now? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Andy Tomlinson, his website, pioneeringnewconsciousness.com. Andy, it goes without saying that most of us are unaware of past lives, between life experiences, and all that stuff. How do the experiences impact our daily life, particularly if we're unaware of them?
Well, it impacts us because not all aspects of the life are planned, but just the major events, such as presumably life partners or family members, and they'll behave in a certain way to enable us to bring up whatever issue that we want. Now, for example, a mother who may want to learn about loss may choose to have a soul group member come down as the baby, and the baby has a miscarriage or an abortion. And I mean, for that soul, they leave the body of the baby and they move on, because it's just a very short click of a finger in terms of the life. But it enables that other soul to experience what it is that they want. And quite often, these key events in our life come up. And one of the things I've discovered in all my years of seeing clients is that we've all got some sort of emotional issue that we're working through. We may keep it quiet, we may not tell people, but there's always some issue that we've got. And particularly at the moment, because the Earth is going through a big shift. The vibration of the Earth is increasing, and it's trying to move into its own version of 5D consciousness. And humanity is going with it. And these high vibrations are amplifying everything. They're amplifying the positive emotions. So if you're feeling joy or love, you'll feel that multiplied by 10. Or if you feel anger or hate, you'll experience that multiply by 10. And it's a wake-up call for people to do something about the unhelpful emotions and to let go of it.
So, speaking of which, the Earth, is the Earth the only place we incarnate, or can we be ETs?
Well, we can be ETs, and I have one of the specialities that I've had is helping people between lives that have come from other planetary systems. Normally, they come down to Earth to help at this particular moment of time because it's very difficult to do the shift, and they tend to be quite evolved spirits of light in human bodies. So no one would recognize who they are because they're just walking around in a human body, but they're often people who bring about major changes to the positive. And they may be working quietly in the background. They don't necessarily need to be people who stand out, but they're taking some aspect of change just to help humanity go through this big change that's happening.
Are these people aware of what they are, or do they just come and feel prompted to do particular things?
Quite often they'll feel there's something not quite right. It feels almost like they're not home. There's something, Earth just doesn't feel right for them. That's one of the clues. Sometimes the soul may not be fully adjusted into the physical body, so they may have a number of ailments, skin problems, or some sort of physical issues that they've had all their life and they have difficulty working through. Simply because souls who have had lots of incarnations on Earth are very highly adapted to working in human bodies. But souls that come in, particularly if they've got a higher vibration, just aren't used to getting into this very dense physical body. It's very highly regarded, apparently, in the spiritual galaxies, that there's not many planets that have these dense bodies that have emotions. And working through life lessons is really hard. So souls who come down are quite delighted to have this experience. And it probably explains why so many of us find that life can be quite difficult at times to work through.
So, do we always come back as humans, or are there animals in the mix?
Well, generally, the animal kingdom in the past has been relatively separate, just as the human forms of evolution have been kept relatively separate. But as we're going through this big shift, it's almost like everything is lifting to a different level. So, for example, spirit guides and evolved spirits of light will start moving on to other things. Souls that are ready to expand their consciousness will start perhaps behaving like spirit guides, or are starting to be much more energy aware. And animals, or some animals, are starting to move to the point where they're ready to incarnate as humans. Quite often pets, it's almost like some pets are curious about what humans are doing. It's almost like they're saying, oh, well, when I come back as a human, I think I need to know these skills. But it is a shift that's only just started, because in the past, they have been totally separate. And
So,
it wasn't normal.
what about the spirit of, say, a planet? Planet, okay, is that an incarnation situation as well?
Yeah. I mean, everything has got soul energy, otherwise it wouldn't exist. It would just simply decay and go to dust. So the soul that inhabits the planet, some people refer to it as Gaia or the Divine Mother, she has chosen to change her consciousness because all the planets in the galaxy are changing their vibration. But she's having a lot of trouble shifting the vibration because of humans. Humans are trying to control the planet. We can see all of the activities. And the analogy is, it's almost like humans are fleas on the back of a dog, trying to tell the dog what direction it's got to go. And it just won't work that way. You know, in the past, humans were in harmony with nature. You know, they would, you know, like the indigenous tribes of various parts of the world, where they only took what they needed, and they saw the beauty in nature, and they worked closely with it. It's humans, we've forgotten all of that, and we're destroying the planet through pollution and a lot of other activities. And there has to be a big shift. You know, it can't continue on that way.
It's a
And this
sad
is all
state
the
of
wake up.
affairs, isn't it? So, how can you tell if you're viewing a past life as opposed to a genetic memory or an ancestral memory?
Well, if people are going in for a regression and they make the intent to go into a past life, then that's normally what they would go into and check. If they're going in to resolve an issue, it may very well be that there's some generic past life of someone else that's a bit closer to helping the person resolve it than perhaps something that the other person had. I mean, for example, when I've worked with people who are souls that have found that the earth is the very first incarnation, you can't actually go into a past life with them, well, certainly not an earth one. And if you go into a past life in their previous planetary system, you know, where their energy is drifting around, it's very hard for the therapist to meaningfully work through it. So what I normally do is ask them to go into a past life that would be helpful for them. So they would tune into someone else's past life, because they still have emotional issues to work through, even though they may be quite evolved as souls. And then through that experience, they can bring it into the here and now and change who they are. And that's the most important thing. The only reason of going into the past is to change the present. The future is to give us hope. And if we just live in the present, it's a lot easier to cater for all of the things that happen in life at the moment.
So, you speak of the new consciousness. What is that?
Well, the new consciousness is very much like the expanded state of bliss that people experience in the near-death experience, and they all talk about that experience. And also, it's a very similar experience that people have between lives. And with my my colleague Reena Kumar Singham, we have the belief that people can change their consciousness without necessarily having to have a near-death experience by going through a whole series of activities and exercises and work on them, and they can bring about their own change. And this is something that I've written about. I'll just give you a couple of examples. When we're talking about emotions, and this is something that everybody will be experienced, there's two sorts of emotions. There's the emotions that are ours. Now, for example, someone who has a phobia, to take a very simple example, of spiders, their emotional wound is about a spider. And every time they see the spider, the fear is brought to the surface until they decide to own the responsibility for the phobia and clear it. It's not the fault of the spider, it's the person's emotion. So if people see life events happening and feel anger or hate or other emotions, it's not those things, it's something in them that's been triggered, and they need to accept ownership. And there's therapists that can help, there's do-it-yourself exercises. So that's one sort of emotion. It's like a person's own emotion. And then there are emotions that people absorb from the outside. So, for example, when I was in corporate, I
Well,
was
I hate to do this, but you know what? Time flies and
I'll
we
have
are
to.
out of it. So, but Andy, thank you so, so much for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom.
Okay, I'd be delighted being with you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
My pleasure. Our guest this hour has been Andy Tomlinson, a known expert in past lives and the soul experiences between lives, and co-author Between Lives, Past Life Regression, Near-Death Experience, and the Evolution of Consciousness. To find out more about Andy, where you can find his books and all he has to offer, visit his website, pioneeringnewconsciousness.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy our past archived episodes, you can always visit www.missionevolution.org. But please be sure to join us again right here on Voice of Canada Broadcast Network, vocbn.ca, where this mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our rapidly evolving world.